Hey y'all, how we doing today? It's me, Dan, moderately anonymous MTG, and I'm here to talk a little more theory with y'all today. This is a subject that is really near and dear to my heart because I think that this is one of the most important skills that you can have as a cEDH player, and that's how to read your opponents in cEDH. There's a lot of different ways that you can read an opponent in a card game, and I'm not talking about the physicality of a person or their tells like you would talk about in poker, but what I'm talking about is using your knowledge of the cEDH meta to try to decipher what your opponent likely has in hand. One of the most important skills that a Magic player can develop across their time playing Magic is learning how to decipher what is in your opponent's hand. And I think what's really important to note is that this is a lot closer to a science than it is to a guessing game. Is it possible to know what your opponent has in hand exactly at any given point? No, of course not, but you can take very educated guess about what they might have in their hand, and it's going to help you a lot in your games. One of the most common and obvious situations that I think we look at a lot in cEDH is holding open 5 mana when you pass your turn. Everyone knows that a black player who holds open 5 mana and passes the turn probably has Ad Nauseam in their hand, or they're representing that they have Ad Nauseam in their hand because they want you to worry about that. But being able to read your opponents goes so much deeper than this, so I want to take a look at some of the more minute and maybe less obvious ideas than this. First of all, I want to talk about how you can actually decipher what is in your opponent's hand. So unfortunately, the base of knowledge here isn't really a level playing field because the best way that you can know what your opponent is up to in a cEDH is to have an encyclopedic knowledge of what is in the cEDH meta. That means knowing what's going on in the most popular decks. That means paying attention to your opponent's mana bases, how many cards they have in hand, how much mana they're holding open at any given point. There are a lot of fine details, but the thing that you have to remember is that there is a lot of them. There's a ton of clues that are being represented at any point to give you an idea of what might be in your opponent's hand and what they might be playing towards. So let's go back to our original example. In this case, you're the Ad Nauseam player, you're in 4th position. Let's say your first opponent is a Thrasios and Bruce Tarl deck. They play a Tropical Island and a Birds of Paradise and pass the turn. The person in 2nd position is a Tivit player. They play an Underground Sea and a Mana Vault, and they pass the turn. And the person before you is a Nichilo player. They play a Command Tower and a Mana Crypt, and they pass the turn. Then it gets to you in 4th position. Let's say you're on a Grixis pile, and your hand you've got a Wooded Foothills, a Mana Crypt, a Dark Ritual, and an Ad Nauseam. So you're ready to go and rip that Ad Nauseam turn 1. But if we look around the table, the first thing I'm going to think about is player 3 with the Mana Crypt and the Command Tower open. Najeela is always a very proactive deck, so your first thought has to be, why wouldn't this player play Najeela on turn 1 when they have access to it? Are they afraid that Najeela is going to get removed? Or are they maybe holding open an opposition agent? If you can read this first step, you're going to know not to spend your Wooded Foothills here. So if we play out our own Wooded Foothills, our Mana Crypt, and then we pass the turn, we're also technically representing an opposition agent here. This puts a sort of weird dynamic on the table where if the other players are also reading this, they might now be afraid of 2 different opposition agents, so there could be a very tense point about when people are going to spend their fetch lands or their tutors. So let's say you pass it off to player 1 again, goes into turn 2, player 1 now plays another land, and they go to cast a Rhystic Study. Priority gets passed to player 3, and now, hey, let's say that they've got a delay. They were representing 2 things here. Now, this doesn't mean that they weren't also representing this opposition agent. We haven't cleared that as a possibility from their hand, but they were valuing holding up this delay in this situation to try to stop a person ahead of them. Now, with the Rhystic Study getting delayed, and before player 1 is passing off to their turn, maybe now we're able to seize our opportunity with this fetch land, go and get a Badlands, and we use that on Dark Ritual and cast our Ad Nauseam before it gets to player 2's untap step. And now, because you weren't very clearly representing Ad Nauseam on your turn when you passed, you get to sneak that in under the gun. Obviously, this is like the best case scenario of being able to read your opponents and working around what they're doing, but it goes into much finer detail than this. One of the examples that I really like to think about very often is noting which lands that players are searching for in their decks, because it's very telling about which spells they're trying to cast with those lands. If you think about a 4-color pile like Tim Nun Crom, white is the auxiliary color in their deck. It's very much a splash color. Almost all of these Grixis Plus piles are going to want to go for their Underground Sea as their first land for turn if they're able to fetch, because Underground Sea does most of the things that they want to do. It can counter other people's spells, it can be proactive with a Vampiric Tutor, it's just generally the most proactive of your lands rather than something like a Tundra, which tends to be a little bit more defensive. Say, it can only cast a Dispel or a Swords to Plowshares. So maybe turn 1, your Tim Nun Crom opponent plays a Command Tower, they cast some Mana Rock, and then they pass the turn. And then on turn 2, they have a fetch land, and maybe they go for a Tundra rather than their Underground Sea. This might seem like a meaningless sort of thing to a lot of people, but this is your opportunity to start reading your opponent here. What can be in their hand that they want to get this Tundra for first, rather than an Underground Sea, or maybe even a Volcanic Island? Well, what we have to do is think about all of the possibilities of what they might use that mana for. If they do go for a volcanic island, that's a signal to you that they're maybe trying to set it for a dockside extortionist or an underworld breach. If they go for a tundra, that means they might be setting up for a Swords to Plowshares, or worst case scenario, a Grand Abolisher. If you're paying attention to the colors that people are getting with their lands, that's one signal to you of what kind of spells they're casting and what you might need to work around. Another example might be noting the sequencing that players are choosing to use with their cards. If you see a Najeela player, for instance, go turn 1, land, Jeweled Lotus, Najeela is their second spell, and then they use their land to cast a Mystic Remora. Now, common knowledge might be, why would you cast your Najeela before casting your Mystic Remora? If someone tries to counter your Najeela, you want to draw the interaction, or at least draw another card and get that out of the exchange. But what you can infer from this is that this Najeela player is trying to play around Mindbreak Trap, and they value their Najeela higher than they value the Mystic Remora. Does this tell you anything explicitly about what their next actions might be? No, but it might tell you that the Swords to Plowshares that you were thinking about exiling to your Chrome Mox might be better served for your hand if this player is worried about keeping their Najeela on board. Valuing that Najeela means that they're investing their time into this Najeela A game plan, trying to maybe get a Derevi or a Grim Hireling to put on board to start comboing off, rather than trying to play towards their combo B plan and trying to put together an Underworld Breach combo or an Ad Nauseam. A common way that I see new players get got is that they're just not trying hard enough to anticipate what your opponents might play. And even worse, I see some newer players just assume that their opponents are making mistakes. But it's extremely important to remember that bluffing is part of this game. This is, at the end of the game, a card game with hidden information. Bluffing that you have a certain game piece or that you're afraid of a certain game piece holds a lot of power over the psychological aspect of this game. Knowing what cards are in people's decks, what they could possibly be playing for, and most importantly, trying to read what they have in hand is super important for being able to play around things and being able to play to the best of your own ability. If this is something that you want to get better at, I think honestly the best thing that you can do is just play more games of cEDH. Really open your eyes to what your opponents are doing, really pay attention to their sequencing, and most importantly, pay attention to the results of each game. If you record your games and you look back on them already knowing the outcome, it's a lot easier to see the point at which things start to go awry for you or the point at which your opponents start to take the wheel. And while obviously this is going to stop you from ever losing a game of Magic, it is going to help you win a lot more of them. So if this is something that you want to dive deeper into and really up your game, I would suggest going to the cEDH decklist database, really looking through those lists, read the primers, get really familiar with the cards that are in each deck, and use that knowledge to try to map out what your opponents might be doing. If you want to see me do this in action, go check out the Deckside Extortionist series, it's linked right in the card above. This is me in real time reviewing my own gameplay footage and taking a really analytical look at what is going on in each game, how things could have gone differently, and what I might have done to put myself in a better position in them. Anyway, I hope that y'all enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe. It's all really helpful. Go hit up our Patreon if you want to help support the show. And if you want to pick up some awesome merch, go hit up our Bonfire store. TCG Player affiliate link and Dragon Shield affiliate link are both in the description if you want to help support the show. Thank y'all so much for watching. We'll see you next time.